Well, to talk more about overseas drug testing, we're joined by investigative reporter James Steele. He's a co-author of a new article in Vanity Fair titled Deadly Medicine. The piece explores how pharmaceutical companies are increasingly conducting these clinical trials for new drugs outside the United States, usually in countries where regulations are less stringent and trials are much cheaper. 20 years ago, only 271 trials of drugs intended for use by Americans were conducted overseas. By 2008, the number had risen to nearly 6,500, an increase of more than 2,000%. Thousands of trials are taking place in countries with large numbers of poor, often illiterate people who in some cases sign consent forms with a thumbprint or scratch an X.
In some cases, the outsourcing of drug tests has been deadly. In Argentina, 7 babies died while enrolled in clinical trials for GlaxoSmithKline. In New Delhi, India, 49 babies died at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences while taking part in clinical trials over a 30-month period. Joining us in Philadelphia is investigative journalist Jim Steele. He wrote the article with his partner, Don Bartlett. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Jim Steele. Welcome back. You have won virtually every major national journalism award, including 2 Pulitzer Prizes, 2 National Magazine Awards. The latest piece in Vanity Fair is called Deadly Medicine. Explain exactly the scope of your investigation, the companies involved, the countries where experiments are done, and what it has to do with the U.S.
Well, first of all, it's very good to be back with you both, and especially this program today. And Joe Stevens actually just hit the nail on the head when he said that at the heart of this issue is that the U.S. loses control. The U.S. government loses control in these foreign trials. I think what surprised us the most about this whole story is that there have always been some foreign clinical trials. That, on its face, is not new. What astonished us was the speed with which this has happened. The statistics that Juan quoted there at the beginning come from an Inspector General's report just released this last year. But the speed of this is actually accelerated very much in the last 5 to 10 years. It's not just Western Europe. It's parts of the former Soviet Republic. It's places in Africa, developing nations in Asia. But the 2 countries that are going to be at the heart of this more and more in the future are going to be China and India, which have both made this a priority. The Indians have revamped their laws to encourage the development of the clinical trial industry over there. China has made such a priority on teaching English that they're going to be a big factor in this. You now have more people speaking English in China than in India, which I think is one of the things that surprised us about this whole story. So more and more of these are going to be moving abroad. As you mentioned earlier, part of it is expense. And the irony of this is that at the same time, it's cheaper for the companies to go abroad, not just from the cost over there and the fact that there's very little regulation, but it also is much more expensive for the U.S. to even attempt to have any oversight over there. Simply the cost of doing that kind of work abroad is much greater, even if there were the instinct and the desire to do that.
Well, Jim Steele, one of the things I noted in your article is that when you began talking about the FDA database of these clinical trials, that it's wholly inadequate and is not even really tracking all the trials that are occurring, so that would seem to indicate that that some of these pharmaceutical firms could choose to hide the bad results of their clinical trials and only report the good ones.
Absolutely. That struck us as much as any one fact in our investigation, that here you have a situation that when they start one of these trials somewhere, they don't have to report that to the FDA. In fact, they can conduct it for years and not report it to the FDA. And then at some point they may decide, because the results are so bad or because there have been adverse events in many cases means people have died in drug company lingo. When that happens, none of this is reported to the FDA. The only time the FDA becomes involved is when they actually the drug company makes an actual formal application to get a new drug sanction. But if you think about what research is about, trial and error, knowledge, things of that sort that researchers in so many other fields rely on the work of others, especially in this field where people's lives are at stake, where experiments may have gone awry, other companies should need to know that as well as the FDA, but that's not even reported in this. The amazing thing about this to us is that not only are there no regulations really requiring them to report those trials, But even if there were, FDA has so few resources and so little will, it wouldn't even be able to do any kind of effective monitoring of them. So you have a situation here that's totally chaotic. I mean, the FDA's record of overseeing clinical trials in this country has not always been very good. But by these trials increasingly moving to places beyond the scope of the agency, where there's no knowledge, where there's nothing reported, now the agency is losing what little oversight and control it has. And the ramifications for the future in terms of future drugs coming down the track, we think are just potentially horrendous.
Jim, can you explain how you arrived at the number 200,000 people die a year from prescription medicine?
Yes, there's a nonprofit organization based in Pennsylvania called the Institute of Safe Medication Practices. And they have documented the figure of, I think it's 19,500 individuals die roughly each. I think this was in 2008, 2009, from prescription drugs. Any number of other studies have indicated this is a vastly understated number. There's no reflection on the Institute. They do very good work. But everybody agrees that that number is woefully below what the real number is. And most of the estimates have put the figure around 10%. We actually looked into this issue in great detail when we wrote a book on the American healthcare system several years ago. And most people who look at this in any depth have concluded that the reported figures represent about 10% of the actual total deaths. So we concluded, therefore, that you're talking about 200,000 people dying pretty much yearly from prescription drugs. I mean, that's more than die from diabetes and a whole range of other illnesses that affect people out there. So it's one of those unknown, really undisclosed and unpublicized killers that are the consequences of many prescription drugs.
One of the drugs you write about is Celebrex, which at one point I think was bringing in about $3.4 billion a year in revenue to, was it Pfizer? And yet could you talk about the problems that you uncovered? And then in large part, the drug is barely used now.
It is an anti-inflammatory drug used largely for people with arthritis. And when many side effects began to occur with many people, what was interesting to us is how slow the FDA was to react to this. The European Union began pulling it off the shelves over there. Even the Saudi Arabian Drug Agency pulled that's another drug, but the European Union was one of the most instrumental ones to start pulling the drug. Lawsuits began to be filed there and in this country. The FDA was very, very slow to react to that, and now, of course, this drug is not really much of a factor at all. But it's typical of how sometimes the rest of the world is much more attuned to this issue than we are, and that's largely because the FDA is just so much in basically the grip of the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, one of the things that we didn't even actually deal with in great detail in the stories. People think about the influence, they think about lobbying in this country. The lobbying isn't Congress. In the case of the pharmaceutical industry, it's heavily the FDA and Congress. And the numbers are absolutely staggering. It's over $200 million a year that the industry shells out to lobby the agency and to Congress to make sure the system stays intact.
Can you give some examples of the drugs tested and where they were tested? You take a real global perspective on this.
One of the ones that you mentioned at the beginning, Synflorix, was a drug to treat pneumonia and ear infections in children. This was treated. The clinical trial there was in a northern province in Arizona, where many of the parents were illiterate. Where many of the children signed up. The parents had no idea. They thought their children were actually being treated for the disease. They did not realize that it was an actual clinical trial. In fact, one of the local officials there was later found to be, who was conducting this, was later found to be, I think, the brother of one of the ministers of that particular state. That's one area. The former Soviet republics, Kazakhstan, for one, has been a real popular area. Many provinces in primitive areas, rural areas in Romania have also been a real popular area. Rural sections of China, a couple provinces there have been real focal points of this. Extremely populated parts of India, New Delhi, for example, that I believe was also the test you mentioned earlier. That was also an area where folks have been subject to these tests. And what's interesting to us is how these things are increasingly spreading out. In places like China and India, the appeal in those countries is that, frankly, it's jobs. If you're a doctor in one of those places, the money you may make from signing up people to take these tests may well exceed your annual income from the rest of your practice. So it's a tremendous economic incentive in these countries to engage in these tests and to profit from them.